Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. We'll just wait a minute or so while everyone is kind of trickling in here. Um, did want to say, Nabil, I saw your recent post on your espresso brewing, and it was very timely for me because I just got back from a holiday in Mexico where I got to learn about local coffee growing practices like that the Maya are still using. And it was so cool, like to kind of have those two things in my brain at the same time. It was really interesting. Have you been experimenting with any new coffee beans recently?
So I do try to get different coffee beans, but I haven't experimented as much with different coffee beans just yet. But with my new machine, I have a lot more control over the brew process and the different parameters. So I'm looking forward to trying it with new coffee beans. But what I have been doing recently is just trying to learn more about how the beans get to you from actually like from the plant and then the whole process of getting it to be a dark roast, medium roast, or even like how do you get beans that are decaffeinated?
Right.
Those are the types of things that I'm just still studying and learning about. And what I'm learning is how challenging and difficult it is to actually get coffee beans made,
Yeah.
especially and that's also why coffee beans tend to get so expensive, especially when you see them that are called like single origin and so on. So
Mhm.
learning more about that. That's been my latest focus is looking up videos, reading and learning how beans actually get made before they get to me.
That's awesome. Well, you'll have to give me tips because I brought home a very large bag for myself. Awesome. Well, let's get started. If we've got a couple people trickling in, that's totally fine. Thank you again to those of you who have joined today. We're really excited to kick off this webinar. Today's topic is obviously hindsight is 2020. What security leaders wish they knew before implementing generative AI. We've got our guest experts from Google and Verizon, and Nabil is going to introduce those two in just a moment here. A little housekeeping from me before we get started. If you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A. Our panelists will do their best to answer them as we go, but if we don't get to them, we'll definitely follow up with you afterwards. We'll also be sending this recording around after the fact as well so that you can rewatch, at your convenience, and come back and get any tips that you missed in this first run. With that out of the way, I'm going to introduce your NetSpy host for today's webinar, which is our field CISO, Nabil Hanan, and our local coffee expert here. So as our field CISO, Nabil leads NetSpy's advisory consulting practice, focusing on helping our clients solve their cybersecurity assessment and threat and vulnerability management needs. He is also the host of the Agents of Influence podcast, and as I said before, makes a pretty mean espresso. Nabil, I'm going to hand it off to you to introduce our guests for today.
Well, thank you, Emma. And hi, everyone. Really excited for today's conversation. I think it's very timely. And with all the hype around AI over the last year to 2 years or so, I'm really excited, especially for the guests we have today, whom we're going to talk to and learn from. To get us started, the two panelists we have today are Chris Schneider and Tim Schulz. So Chris is from Google, and he works in machine learning security and Android. His work includes platform, application, and data security initiatives across Android, Core, and PSS. And he's also a security research partner with Google DeepMind. His responsibilities include establishing secure by default implementation of Android software and remediating emerging security gaps from machine learning enabled technologies. Lastly, he's a primary partner for Google's SAIF initiative. And then we have Tim. Tim is a distinguished engineer um, and a leader in cybersecurity with a decade plus of expertise in research and engineering. He currently spearheads the AI Red Team at Verizon, where he plays a pivotal role in identifying and migrating AI security risk, ensuring robust defense mechanisms through strategic collaboration with cross-functional teams. Guys, really excited to have you here and can't wait to get into the discussion. But given this topic today is about I actually wanted to kick us off with my gripe against the term AI because I believe it to be a big misnomer. And anything that's termed with the word intelligence, when I read about it, it implies to me that there's some form of sentience. But in this case, obviously, the technologies we're talking about are not sentient. We're not quite there yet. But they're just, from my perspective, really, really, really good at digesting large amounts of data and computing the data itself to get back some sort of an output very quickly, which often may look and feel like sentience or intelligence, but it really isn't. So that's my perspective on the terminology for AI. I know that it's not a probably not a popular opinion, but I would love to hear from you guys. What do you think about the technology itself and how it's named?
Tim, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll say I think Nabil, like, so I'm not going to give you a straight answer. I'll just set that out right away because I think really like generative AI has driven this discussion right around what does that foundation mean of artificial intelligence? And so there's lots of debates right over the terminology. And I think realistically this comes down to like AI is big in the public space now. It's been around through Hollywood and all of that, so everyone has different opinions of what they think it is. But I think really what we're seeing is that like the definition isn't meeting the needs of the nuanced discussions that are having to happen as part of this development of the technology now. And so I think that's one of the big challenges is that while it's very easy to talk about the umbrella term AI to anyone in the general public, right? Everyone's heard about it one way or another. I think that what we're seeing is that as the field is continuing to accelerate and more breakthroughs and things are happening, that some of those foundational definitions that there was sort of I guess, probably an assumed level of agreement or understanding on like what is AI as a field is those things are starting to sort of crumble. And so I think that discussions like these are good. And I think there are definitely a variety of opinions out there between all sorts of experts. So I would say, I don't know if your opinion's actually an unpopular one. It's more just there's a lot of discussion around this right now.
Chris, what are your thoughts on the topic? And maybe you can even elaborate a little bit, helping us understand the difference between AI and ML.
Sure. I'm largely in line with Tim's opinion. I think that AI as a term, it's certainly more familiar to the general public than, say, machine learning. And it feels like there's more historical marketing, with AI, right? Like the use of the term AI builds on the interest of the familiar. It's all very understandable. But as Tim mentioned, there are considerations with what I'll broadly call popular media that may blur some of the factual aspects of what's capable and various concerns, et cetera. We've seen this from various celebrities, right? They'll chime in and say their piece, which is totally fair. But I would argue that many of the claims they're fanciful, right? As a scientist, right? I like to consider myself to be a scientist. Uh, I would prefer to approach these things with caution and say, the capabilities that we have now are definitive as this. This is how they're demonstrated, and then talk about what we think the next steps are, hopefully using some evidence from the past. That doesn't mean that other people can't obviously voice their opinions, etc., but it can create kind of hysteria, right? For the robot uprising and stuff like that. That is not generally how at least I see the field. I see it as forecasting and doing things with probabilistic outcomes, and then doing that in a way that is mirrored to some aspects of observed behaviors, etc. So it's very much a memorize and repeat with some probabilistic synthesis rather than any kind of independent intelligence or forethought to it.
So since both of you brought up the topic of, just the media and movies portraying AI in a certain way, I have to ask, what is your favorite movie AI, fictional AI character, fictional AI system that's out there? I'll kick
Oh
us off so
man.
you guys have a second to think about it because I know this was not on the list of questions I gave you, but I think mine is Kit from Knight Rider. I'll just leave it there. So let me start with Tim. Tim, what's your favorite fictional
Ooh,
AI character?
there's so many good ones to pick. I mean, personally, like, one of I'll say early inspiration, was the Matrix, right? And Agent Smith, being sort of going in and out of, all the agents going in and out of, people and that. So I think from like, that was one of the first, bad guys that I think you could probably say is, an AI agent, right? That I think that would he's probably my favorite, I guess, if I had to just pick right now. I also would say Demoiselle from Foundation is another one that for anybody that's watched that recently.
Chris, what about you?
Ironically, we're going straight to sci-fi. So I'm gonna drop a name here of Larry Yeager, who is he's my former advisor. He was in the background of the Terminator 2 film, and he's awesome. He's a great inspiration. So I know everybody thinks about the Terminator with these things, so I have to mention it. A more popular reference in terms of relatability might be something like the Puppet Master from Ghost in the Shell, right? This actual emergence of intelligence, right? This AGI, which is really what people are thinking about when they're considering self-elected behaviors, et cetera. But
Yeah, and when it comes to movies, yeah, go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
no, it's okay. I was gonna say, my personal is a little more esoteric. It's actually The Accession from Ian Banks's Culture series, which if you have the time, definitely read those books and then be sad that there aren't any more.
No, all I was going to say is when it comes to movies, I also think Spielberg's AI was way ahead of its time. That came out so long ago, but I thought it was pretty impressive on how it dealt with the moral dilemmas of AI and building systems that mimic human behavior.
This is the one where they're basically discarded, right? Like, I don't want to spoiler alert from 25 years ago or whatever and it came out, but right, like these things are imbued with some level of agency and then they're thrown away.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's quite tragic
Exactly.
and very sad. Yeah. I think I've
All
seen
right.
that film
Well,
exactly once.
let's get back
Sorry.
on topic, guys. I think we've diverted enough. So let's start by asking both of you. I would like your perspective, obviously, on, what are some things to consider before organizations start their journey leveraging AI-based technologies. So, are there certain questions you think organizations should be asking themselves while they're making the assessment of, cybersecurity readiness before they adopt AI-based technologies? And are there common pitfalls that organizations run into because they just haven't really thought it through, but they're rushing to adopt technology because that's the new trend today? Maybe Tim, maybe you can kick us off there.
Ooh, that's a big one. And I think we already have the start of our next webcast, right? Is reviewing AI, movie like agents in movies and entertainment. So, but I think one of the big things, like when it comes to like readiness around using AI, and I think this is the big thing is like don't half-ass it, right? That's one of the big things that I'd say when organizations are looking at what are like we want to do something with AI, right? We're trying to capitalize on the market hype, or we think it can help us or do these things. I think one of the big questions that organizations or teams should ask themselves is what types of resources can we or do we want to put towards this? Because this is something that when you're looking at now, we have to secure this whole new type of asset, right? If you're hosting models or things like that, like I think everyone looks at AI or ChatGPT or any of these things as this sort of blob, right? Amorphous blob, this black box that then somehow has an API hooked up to it that you then send things to and get responses. And I think there's a lot of infrastructure and engineering that Chris and others, I think, have put a ton of time and effort in to make this look seamless, right? Where there's security, there's guardrails, there's all of these things, but there's a ton of work that goes into it. And I think that that's one of those things that it can be easy to think, hey, I'm going to go download a model from Hugging Face or this or that and try and just host it locally or try and bolt it onto my web app and it'll be fine. And that's not exactly how it works. And so I think that's one of the biggest things is dedicating resources towards it, as well as then sort of going all in on your approach. And then the second thing that I'll talk to that I think is really, really big is, and this sort of touches on both the how to assess as well your readiness as well as a pitfall, is AI literacy, or being able to talk intelligently about AI. Because this is something that every vendor now, right, is an AI vendor as well, or they have something. And this is a trend that I've talked to other folks, and we've sort of noticed similar things where vendors on calls, when they start talking about AI, you can almost see people like assessing the level of expertise they're going up against, right? And so if they can sort of talk past you on AI and they hit a point where they're like, the folks I'm talking to don't really know what I'm talking about here, it can really create a weird power dynamic. And that's where, if folks aren't comfortable to say, I don't understand that, or don't want to push back because they don't want to seem like they don't know, that's the kind of stuff that, this is where, if you're not going to have the AI expertise internally, you need some sort of partner, trusted third partner. It could be either services and companies that you do trust and work with. It can be, you know, someone that you've worked with before. But those are the types of things that I think are really important, because, for instance, when you start diving into this world of AI, you're going to hear it like, this is one of my favorite examples, is inference, right? When you hear inference, and the first time people hear it, they're like, oh gosh, like, what is that? This is some machine learning stuff. I don't understand it. And it's like, you're chatting, right, with the chatbot. And that process is of getting the result back to you. And so while that's obviously a big generalization for some of the terms, I think that's one of the big things that organizations and teams need to understand, is you are going to have to invest time into this, whether it's about whether you're going to trust somebody else, but you do need to learn about what is the terminology, what are the things that vendors and people are going to talk to, and then how do I fit that into where the risk we're willing to take, because that's another big piece of this, is like, there's changing regulations. And so that is something that this isn't a set it and forget it. It is going to be a very active part of what you're doing. And so that's going to be something that, if this is something that, you know, constant maintenance and operation is not something you want to do, then it's probably best to outsource and look to leveraging service providers that have something that is sort of ready-made and ready to go.
Love that, Tim, and makes so much sense. So, you know, for kind of extending from there, then, Chris, I would love to learn from you. Are there certain ways organizations can maybe ensure that their AI initiatives align with their cybersecurity goals and protocols?
Yes, definitely. But I'm going to speak about this on behalf, well, from a perspective of an employee at Google, but not on behalf of Google. One of the ways that we approach this in our org is to use something called the Android AppSec Knowledge Base, or AAKB, as we refer to it. And basically what this does is, inside Android Studio, you automatically get alerts as a developer in real time to common errors or security risks. The errors can have quick fixes as well associated with them, and it's pretty easy. You know, press Control-Dot to fix this. It doesn't work for all issues, of course, but we're expanding it to focus on ML implementations, and we're aligning that to something called SAFE, which is, I think you mentioned it earlier, actually, in my intro. Thank you. It is the Google Safe AI framework, SAFE, and it's pretty simple, right? Like, the idea here is that there's a set of guidelines and controls that we would like to map. That's one of the responsibilities that I help contribute to on my team. And we try to make sure that, say, existing controls like rate limiting, ACLs, authentication, can help abate some of the issues related to using ML-enabled technologies. It doesn't work for all of them, right? There are new things that are emerging that we can talk about, where we need to research and develop new types of controls, frankly. Each of those, by the way, can be tuned to different organizations' needs. So obviously what's good for, say, Google or other people in their own spheres is important to them. A little sale a bit on the AAKB side is that it's all open source. So individuals can actually apply their own logic if they want. It's not do as Google. It's, you know, how do we do this collectively in the best way possible and be responsible about it? And those take cues already from existing literature, or at least the start of that literature, like ISO 27090 and 27091. They're not officially published yet, but we're looking at the feedback that other people are saying, right? We're looking at the published NIST feedback. We're taking cues from MITRE and OWASP, et cetera, and genuinely trying to be really good community, players in this. Like, this is new to us too, or at least new to me. Again, not speaking on behalf of Google. And it's hard. It's really difficult. So, yeah.
Any thoughts, Chris, on or Tim, you as well, on the community itself and the output that it's generating in terms of guidance and what to think about? Um, I often worry that when there's community guidance, it ends up having to be just too generic, right? It's often just too high level because they're trying to make it applicable for everybody versus being overly prescriptive or having enough meat to really have a way for someone to go and implement something. Curious what your thoughts are on the community guidance that's out there so far, and are there certain things you were maybe hoping to see in the future that's just not there yet?
Quick clarifying question: do you have a specific guidance that you're thinking about, or is this just
I
more
mean,
general, like from what you've read?
it's more of a general question is based on what you're seeing out there. Are the resources from the community enough today? And are there certain areas that you wish there was more content, or you're hoping there will be more content soon because it's all new to us anyways?
I'm greedy. Sorry, go ahead, Tim. I'll speak
Oh
after
no,
you.
I was gonna say, I mean, I've got opinions on most things, so I can always take a stab. I mean, I think one of the big challenges in this area, like, is that AI, like, most of the time, by the time a technology becomes popular enough that it has the widespread sort of knowledge and I'll say sort of talkability, right? Being able to talk to someone at a bar, at a sporting event or whatever about something. It's sort of been, there's a distributed amount of knowledge about it. And we're at a space, right? We're at a place right now in AI where that it is still very expert driven in a lot of different ways. And so I think that what that has meant is that there's not enough knowledge across organizations to tackle this right now. Things are coming out at a speed that even people that have been in the field for years and years aren't able to keep up with all parts of it because there's just so much happening all over the place. And so that's where I think the real positive benefit is that a lot of these community efforts around building some sort of community of knowledge, some of those are really good because they are, like, the information is cheaper, as in free and widely available. However, comes with caveats, right? The positive part of it being so easy to find information about all these different parts of AI also means that for folks that aren't experts or aren't able to sort of pick one thing and stick with it, it's really hard to figure out what is a quality source, right? Because there's plenty of quantity. What is the quality that you can go to? And so I think this is where we've seen Google, we've seen Meta, we've seen Microsoft publishing and releasing tools, things like that. And I think that has helped, especially when we're talking about AI security, in sort of there's been these actions, these executive orders, and one of the challenges that I've seen is that there's not a common tool set, right? We're still pretty early on in learning how to test models. So that's the kind of thing that I'd say some of those community involvement, even by the really large players, technology companies in this area, has, I'd say, sort of helped distribute some of that expertise around. But I think it is one of those things where it's still a challenge because there is sort of a knowledge barrier to entry if we're trying to move beyond conversations just about, prompting some of these models in the first place.
Awesome. No, that's really insightful too. And then, we've spent some time talking about what can be done proactively about before adopting AI-based technologies. But then we do understand, I think all of us, all the three of us definitely understand that that's not the scenario you find yourselves in. Often organizations adopt first and then deal with the pitfalls and challenges later. So would love to understand from you guys in the field, what have you seen as some of the most common cybersecurity pitfalls that organizations have been encountering when they go ahead and implement AI technologies, and if there's any recommendations you have as to best practices to try and avoid those?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that it's one of those that it's like you said, organizations are going to adopt it. You know, we can talk about what the ideal state is, right? But the reality is Gen AI is coming. It's going to be in your organization in some form or fashion, whether you're consuming it, whether you're leveraging it. And so security teams all around are going to be asked, right? All right, you need to secure this now. And what does security mean around it? And I think one of the I am going to tie back to my AI literacy, but for a different reason here. In that knowledge of where you can see things and understand things with AI systems and how they're engineered, and the difference between that and like protecting web applications as normal is, I think, one of those big things. Because when organizations are trying to put together, for instance, an incident response plan, AI incident response can be completely different, and the log sources are going to be different. There's going to be information that security teams are used to having, right? Is sort of like, hey, we have all this data, we have all these logs potentially, and it's really about combing through it and then deciding, hey, this piece we can correlate with this piece and that kind of thing. And sometimes tools, of course, are going to help you do that. Where there is still some gaps in visibility when it comes to AI systems and the models themselves. You hear about data poisoning and some of that stuff, and even there's some discussions and vendors and things like that talking about detecting these things. But realistically, a lot of that right now is still in, I'll call it the research phase, where there are some models where the explainability of it is good, but that's not the norm. And so I think that's where we've got explainable AI and AI transparency are sort of those buzzwords that are kind of important to understand, like, where is the visibility that I'm going to have as a CISO, as a team that is in charge of protecting these? And then, how do we make sure that we understand what is the difference between our regular incident response process versus an AI incident response, because those are potentially going to be different teams. If to give an example, if you have an extensive data science team or data science teams, if a model, for instance, if it starts, we'll say, misclassifying things and changes how it's been performing, like, when do you call cybersecurity, right? And so those are some of the common questions that I'll say, as a whole, I think a lot of data science teams, at least from a lot of the teams I've talked to, have honestly been sort of left alone, right? For, we'll say, like a decade plus, and they've been doing their work. They've been sort of set up in this process, and generative AI has now meant that all models and all things are now being looked at. They are being sort of impacted by this big hype and the sort of attention that's drawn to all things AI. And so that can cause friction, right, between teams, because these are teams that previously weren't dealing with security as much, and may have had responsible AI and some of that to work with, but aren't used to working with cybersecurity. And so those are the types of things that's a people thing. And this is getting the right people in a room. This is building those relationships, and it's not a quick fix. Because this is dynamic, because this is moving, it means that things are going to change. Processes that you build right now probably will have to change in the next 6 months, and maybe sooner, depending on what things come out. Working with legal, this is another big thing that we're seeing. The Use AI Act, as well as other things, is like there has to be some level of, whether it's inside counsel, outside counsel, if you're looking at building models and systems, like, these are things you have to consider now, because compliance is already here for some of the AI systems. And that's something that I think in cybersecurity has taken a little bit of time to figure out, like, what is going to meet those requirements. And right now those discussions are happening, in real time, for AI.
No, that's very true. And I think it's even more important now to be flexible and adopt new processes and tweak and modify the various processes around whether it's AI-based technology or just technology in general, because as both of you mentioned, the rate of innovation we're seeing is faster than ever before, and I have a feeling it's only going to continue accelerating over time.
Nabil, I just want
That,
to like I
yeah,
want to call that out real quick because like we've mentioned it and like I really want to like foot stomp or whatever, like exclamation point, like this is, and as Chris has mentioned too, this is proceeding at a ridiculously fast pace. Like new things are coming out sometimes daily or weekly or hourly, like depending on the week. And so like this is like also in my experience, I have not seen anything that has been developing from sort of that research to productization and coming out with POCs as well as being baked into products. Never seen anything like it from just that entire, I'll say, technology maturity timeline from research to practice has been just mind-bogglingly fast.
I can add a little bit to this, actually. Obviously, the phrase "adopt and adapt" comes to mind, but to be more concrete about it, there are traditional issues with code, and then there are new issues. Without getting too far into software engineering architecture jargon, software can execute in stages, and ensuring that those stages occur in order as expected is non-trivial, right? We haven't figured that out even for discrete or non-ML workflows. Machine learning introduces an intentional variance both in the input and output. Things that we're taught to avoid as software developers generally. So what now? Well, the traditional approach in SRE or DevOps or however you want to view it, as like this backend, middleware, front end, as it was ages ago, is not the same for machine learning, right? There are multiple stages. I've seen it divided into 5, 7, 11, various different pieces. But I tend to think about it as a pre and post training and a pre and post deployment set, largely with the help of actually one of my colleagues who used to run the ML security stuff at Miner, actually, a lovely guy named Mikkel. So for infrastructure, that approach works, I think, fairly well, even if it's mostly along traditional lines. There are some things we might need to do that are machine learning specific. Like if we're looking at ML candidate models, we want to make sure that we do adversarial testing and make sure that they haven't gone through this whole process, with a backdoor or data poisoning, although backdoors and data poisoning are really hard to detect, but you get the idea. Or non-infrastructure controls, things that aren't existing on servers per se, but on devices, it's a lot more difficult. The person in physical possession of executing code has a large advantage in terms of its administration and control. That's one of the axioms of the security world, and this hasn't changed. It's just more complicated now. There are some controls that I think that are being worked on at Google without revealing too much that may help with this. I'm excited about that. Maybe I'll get to talk about that in the future. But hybrid models, for example, remain a viable approach in many cases, depending on the risk profiles and appetites of businesses. And we've seen that in, say, like the gaming industry, right? If you go and, I guess I shouldn't name names per se, but if you purchase a game license, technically, I suppose, from a popular gaming company, you may only install a client to that game, and the actual game is actually running on their servers, etc. And this helps those industries stabilize things like piracy or whatever else. Not advocating for any A or B, but you can see why the model was useful, right, for their particular type of business operations. So, and some people will choose to have that same thing until ML is maybe a little bit more robust in terms of what assurances can be provided when it's in use. Frankly, we don't want person A to be able to use our thing to do, band whatever is on this list, and that's fair, right? It makes sense.
So Chris, if I can kind of tie this into another challenge that we see with regards to testing of software systems in general, right?
Mm.
I believe we have gotten very used to testing traditional software paradigms, right? Where there is a deterministic behavior. And, it's like there's a set of preconditions, there's the input, the expected output, and it's very easy to test when you have deterministic behavior of a system that you want to test and do regression testing and QA testing and security testing and so on. There's a bigger challenge with a lot of the AI-based systems where they're non-deterministic now, and the traditional testing techniques don't really work. So, can you help us understand a little bit more on the uniqueness of the challenges when it comes to actually testing AI-based systems compared to a traditional software or application?
A bit, yeah. Just thinking about this for a minute. On the security side, right? We're focusing on achieving security parity, right? Using the current controls, and then for emerging threats or new capabilities for ML, how do we manage those if we find that they're a gap, like the existing controls don't work for this? What do we do? For example, the synthesis of identity. You used to be able to go in and, I don't know, steal someone's identification and then impersonate them, right? In various ways. You could mimic their voice if you're very clever. That is now trivial. I think that technologies online now for audio synthesis only required 3 seconds of sample data, which is pretty crazy for
Yeah,
convincing
usually like
whatever that metric is.
your voicemail greeting is enough for someone to copy and then replicate.
Yeah, bingo. And identity, and so in the security world, right? We just, for any people who don't already know this, there's identify, right? And then you authenticate, and then you authorize, right? Like you want to do something with that. And the analogy I like to use at work is something like, I'm famous person A. Here's my driver's license, which entitles you to drive, and you believe that because you might have a driver's license that's issued from the same issuer, like a state or something like that, if you're in the States. And there you go. If you can start synthesizing video, audio, and mannerisms, you can start convincing people that you are that person. And that will allow you to do other things, like maybe obtain a permanent identification or some other foothold. And we've seen this, unfortunately, used in. I don't like the security term of butchering and things like this, as they call it. This was quite graphic, but basically they gain confidence. These attackers gain confidence of people claiming that they're like their children or something, and then these vulnerable people send them money, and it's usually a large sum of money, and it's really sad. How do we prevent that? That's something that I'm super passionate about, and I'm hoping that we have more public information on how we're working to tackle that in a semantic way, in a provable way, not using probabilistics. But from the SWE side, to talk about it opposite to that, there's sort of a couple of themes, right? There's what I call stochastic and non-stochastic software. So people are really focused on Gen AI. I think there's more to it than this, right? In the 90s, there's fuzzy logic and everything else. And then as we get further and further on, we're calling it different things. I think in 57, we had hidden Markov models, I think, introduced with like Baum Welch and Vertivi and all that. So it's a long-standing thing. But it used to be the case that we could look for a clear domain and range, right? These inputs, those outputs, they taught you that, as mentioned before. Now we're looking more toward, the mass collection of data, regardless of source. And this violates a huge rule in security, which is authenticate before you operate. If the first thing in fact, actually, I think Moxie Marlinspike, I think he's more popularly known, mentions this in a crypto blog, where I think it's called the Doom principle, where basically the idea is if the first thing you do is not to verify the authenticity of the data, you're just waiting for the DOM to explode. Just don't do that. And so we kind of have the same problem here, but we've accepted it. We're just saying, I don't care if this cat picture actually has a bunch of dog picture metadata in it. I want all of the cat pictures. And that is what's king, particularly in ML. And that's one of the challenges, right? Vetted data sets, those are going to be important. I feel like we've had our atomic steel moment. And now that people know that, these large models are being trained on just indiscriminate data ingestion, you're going to start seeing more indirect prompt injection, I think, as they call it, right? It's more about, astroturfing and popularizing ideas that may not be factually correct, but may benefit a certain part of your group. Lastly, to talk about not all the doom and gloom in this, the testing of security systems, testing the security of systems, where behaviors are intentionally inconsistent, and they work off unauthenticated, untrusted data sources is difficult. It always has been. And it's part of life. Like, it's not like this is a new thing for ML. One thing that IBM hinted at actually a long time ago, back in 2001, under, I think it was Paul Horn and I'm forgetting the names now. I'm so sorry. Galen. I'm going to forget this. Apologies for the people that were in the autonomic computing group at the time. But they hinted at something called utility functions. And basically, they were testing behavioral targets in contrast to, say, unit or integration testing. And again, for people who are not familiar with these terms, unit, does this function return one of these things that I would expect? And integration being, does this series of functions, right? And we've seen similar approaches along the lines, for example, trying to reduce covariant or drift in models. When you have a model and you publish it, its behavior might change over time, and we want to bring that back. We do that with the utility function, right? By testing the behavior of it over time and then through a broad histogram. I guess I've rambled on here a bit, so apologies, but the dilemma might be summarized as too much control and you lose the innovation aspects, too little and the outputs might be undesirable across a number of broad criteria.
No, that's helpful, Chris, and it's good for us to kind of get into some of the weeds there, which is helpful. Which kind of leads me to my next question, which I'll target to Tim. You know, given what you've been doing from a red teaming perspective, I'm curious. What are some things that organizations need to do to ensure comprehensiveness from a coverage perspective when they are actually doing security testing for AI-based systems? Any tips or tricks that have worked well for you that you wish you had known earlier?
Well, I think one of the things is trying to, like, for organizations as a whole, I think the question is going to be, what are, like, realistically, where can you do testing? Because if you are building foundational models, right, or even small language models and looking at getting into that stuff, that's where you're going to need to understand, sort of, as Chris did a nice job breaking that down earlier, right, that pre and post training versus, like, I'll say the maintenance and operations when it gets deployed, like in LLM ops. And so I think that's an area that for a lot of organizations, you are going to be, like, in the deployment phase. And this is going to be a lot of times where you're going to have an application, right, a web application, and this is something that now has some LLM component hooked up to it, right? Whether it's something that's a chatbot to help with customer service, or trying to source different articles that might be useful or helpful to that person. And I think one of the things that when I'm looking at these systems is trying to make sure that I have a good understanding of what the intended behavior is, because that's one of those things that, as Chris mentioned, and sort of has been the theme all along with everything we're talking about, right, is part of the reason these things are becoming so popular is because of that innovative aspect, right? Because it can be dynamic and it isn't just the same thing where if I ask the same question, I'm going to get the exact same answer. And so that's one of those things that I think is a really important aspect of these systems when you're testing them, is to, like, make sure, like, one of the first things I always do is go through as a regular user would, right? What are those things? Asking the questions that the development team what type of customer they're gearing it towards. And so that's something that I always start with, is make sure that you understand how it's going to work. I document all of those cases. And the other big thing that I think that's really key in testing and red teaming some of the stuff for most organizations is going to be cost, because the majority of times this is getting tied to an API, right, where you might get charged per request, per response. And you see sometimes where developers will put in, and there's features where, hey, like, you can cache certain responses. So if something is similar enough, right? It can essentially shortcut having the LLM generate something brand new. Again, these things are about keeping costs down, and that's why small language models and some of that have come up. But that's something that from a red teaming, or if you're a pen tester looking at these different applications, if you can expand the context length, right? Because that's something where if you can increase the response from 500 characters to 5,000 or 50,000, then that's something that if somebody, isn't watching their bill for these things, they're going to all of a sudden have a really big number at the bottom at the end of the month. And so that's one of the big things that is, I think, driving a lot of research around efficiencies right now. Is like we've seen a lot of the power of what these huge models can do, and realistically, there's very few organizations that are going to be training and using things that are that big. So it's going to come down to, if you're using an API call to one of those big ones, then make sure that you have some level of guardrails around that cost. Because if attackers can use traditional ways, or pen testers can use traditional ways, inject parameters, that kind of thing, to change those behaviors, it's one of those things that it is a valid thing, right? You might want for some responses to have 20 words and others to have 200. But that's something that can quickly drive up costs, and that's another thing that's that can be really concerning. The other piece that I'll mention, right, is brand protection, right? This is a big thing for anyone that is leveraging generative AI, especially if there's on something that is a public-facing website, for instance, right? You have your logo there. Somebody can use this. You use a prompt to generate something charged, whether it's politically or to make a comment on a scenario, right? And then can screenshot that, post it on social media, and potentially cause negative marketing impacts and some of that. So I think that those are a couple of the things to think about that are less on the, I'll say, pure security, and red teaming here isn't necessarily the same thing as how we've thought about it in, I'll say, enterprise cybersecurity. You might have some overlap with teams, but this is an area where it does require looking at more than, I'll say, just the technical controls and what you can do. You are going to be creative, and there's going to be some impacts here that aren't purely in the realm of, I'll say, bits and bytes, that are still worth highlighting, and frankly partnering with folks in like responsible AI teams if you have the ability to do that, because there's a wide range of impacts that these systems can have, and it goes far beyond just the technology itself.
Love it. Love it. Well, we're running up against time, so I have one last question for both of you, and we'll try to keep this short so we can wrap up on time. And the question I have is this: if you could go back in time and share one lesson with your younger self that would have helped you with your AI journey so far, what would that be? Chris, you want to kick us off, and then we'll go to Tim?
Yeah, briefly, synthesis of content may be beneficial, but it comes with an inherent trade. The ability to produce unique, novel interactions is proportionate to the amount of error the business is willing to accept. You can literally find this in a term called temperature if you're in biz. Yeah, opposite to this, if content is generated by the business that determines, for example, payment information, that can pose challenges and should be considered before use. If you're looking for a starting point, or if I was looking for a starting point, I found Mikhail Rodriguez's aforementioned pre-post training and pre-post deployment are great starting points, and I tend to augment those with networking, hardware, operating system, and application context, just to really bolt it down when I'm doing any kind of threat model review.
Awesome. So Tim, bring us home.
All right. I mean, I think similar to what Chris mentioned, I'd probably say, like, send myself a couple of specific resources on, like, hey, this really helped to like hone in on specific lessons around like just background on neural networks and some of that. But I think overall, the big thing is to continue to use these systems, right? I touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's learn how these systems are used. Why is there, there's this hype around the technology and what it can do, and we've had this whole discussion around it. Like, besides just, the theory and knowledge of it, is interacting with the systems, and go try different prompts. Don't try and do prompt injection. Try and get this to do the things that, people advertise. Like, you can go on LinkedIn and any of these, and you can see everyone has their chat GPT, hacks and sheets and stuff like that. And frankly, try out some of that stuff. Does it work for you? Is it hype? Is it not? Because those are some ways that I think we've seen there's a lot of creativity from a lot of different backgrounds. And this is where sort of the diversity of thought is super important, because it's going to give you all these different approaches. So I think it's just would be sort of, telling myself, focus on some of that stuff, look at that, experiment, and continuing to experiment and learn, because that's really the best way to gain knowledge about all of this.
Love it. Well, gentlemen, thank you both for your time, knowledge, candor, humor, and everything else, and indulging with my silly questions at times. We truly appreciate it. Emma, back to you.
Thank you guys so much. This was really wonderful, Chris and Tim, Nabil. Thank you. This has been great. Thank you to everyone who joined. Just a reminder that we will be sending out the recording after this, so you can rewatch. And any questions that we couldn't get to during the Q&A, we'll follow up with you as well. So thank you all very much for coming. We'll